Everyone, it is October 15th, and we have no guest speaker here tonight in person. However, Dr. Eddie Alford is going to be our guest speaker on the natural resource implications of the environmental laws for land managers. Dr. Alford was formerly the forest supervisor for the Lewis and Clark National Forest in Montana, and in that position, he had to review and consider whether to approve or deny any kind of permit application for exploitation of minerals, range and grazing rights, and permits, and also things like mineral harvesting, timber harvesting. So he has had a lot of experience in this. There's already an introduction built into it, so I'm going to leave it at that and just tell you what the plan for the class tonight is. So we're going to listen to this. I will pause it once in a while to make sure that there's opportunity for questions from the students. And Tommy and Carlos, do we have any online students logged in? No. Okay. Let me know if there are, because they will need to be informed of the need to have their computer set to try to find the approximate place on this video. They're not going to be able to hear audio on their home computer, so they have to watch it separately using the link that's been posted in the chat box there. But for those of you who are in the class, you're going to get the real video experience. What else do we need to cover on this? So I want to also pause it whenever you may have a question. So if any of the students in the class have a question, just raise your hand and I'll pause the video and I'll try to address your question. I may not be able to answer it because I'm not the subject matter expert here. Dr. Alford is. But nonetheless, I know a lot about what he had to deal with when he was in this position. So I think I can answer most of your questions. Anything else before we get started from the students? Does it sound like a plan? It's about an hour and a half. We should get done early, but I want to make sure you have opportunity for discussion, question, and answers. So feel free to lift your hand and raise your hand, and I'll probably stop it a few times myself and just ask for some discussion. Okay, here we go. Scheduling conflict. I'd like to give Dr. Alford a brief introduction and then turn it over to him. So Dr. Alford is a lecturer here with our Polytechnic program at the Polytechnic campus for the Applied Biological Sciences at the College of Letters and Sciences, where he teaches many courses in biology, ecology, at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. Dr. Alford has his PhD in environmental analysis planning from ASU, master's degree in range ecology, and bachelor's degree in range science. So Dr. Alford has been teaching here at ASU for probably about 8 years, I'd say, and has been very successful and a fine colleague to have here with us on the campus. He's a specialist in restoration ecology, and also has many years of professional experience, especially with the National Forest Service. Before coming to ASU, Dr. Alford was the lead person in charge of the National Forest Service for developing a forest ecology management plan. I hope I'm saying that right. So Dr. Alford is basically the lead author of the National Forest Service national plan for how we have better forest management. He's also a former forest supervisor for the Lewis and Clark National Forest in Montana. This is a position which is the highest ranking forest official who has the decision-making responsibilities for all of the environmental permits that are given out or applied for within that particular forest area. And that's the main reason why Dr. Elford is our subject matter expert today, because he's been there in the decision maker's seat to decide whether or not to issue these environmental permits. Dr. Elford also is the Conservationist of the Year Award recipient in the early 2000s from the Arizona Wildlife Federation, and has been working closely with many faculty here in the ERM program for years. So welcome, Dr. Elford. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Al, and hello, everyone. So today's topic that I want to talk about is environmental policy and management on public lands. I want to qualify that, though, as actually from my perspective, as far as the experience that I have on public lands. And so looking through that, as far as environmental policy and law goes, this is a very small part of environmental policy and law. Environmental policy and law gets pretty complicated pretty fast. And so really, in my career, I had someone that were experts in environmental policy, and then of course we have environmental lawyers in the Forest Service, the agency that I worked for most of the time. So anyway, just a qualification. So what I'd like to do is emphasize the importance of law and policy in management of public lands. You probably realize that, but I want to give it one more emphasis. Why is that really important? I want to introduce some major laws that basically shape the way land managers, public land managers, manage those lands and natural resources. And most of my focus is going to be on Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands. So I worked 31 years with the Forest Service and just about 1 year with the Bureau of Land Management, but worked pretty closely with the Bureau of Land Management also. So I will have some application with the Bureau of Land Management. So I want to present these laws in kind of a chronological order. So I think it's important to understand what the purpose of the law is. So this chronological order will tell you the issues that occurred during that time sequence of that era, that environmental era mostly, and then the laws that were passed to address the concerns that they had during that time. And then, how the last thing I want to talk about is how those laws are applied and how the Forest Service especially uses the law, interprets the law, and uses environmental policy and then regulations to permit actions or to support actions that are on national forests. Okay, so why is there a need for law and policy in management of federal lands? So being a manager, there's times you think, well, I really need this flexibility. If I could cut through some of this red tape, I would be better off. I could do my prescribed burns and get it done in a lot shorter time period if I didn't have so many of these environmental laws to have to deal with. But these environmental laws are important. They're important because with such a vast area and so many states in the U.S. affected by federal lands, there's need to be consistent. So there's consistency is important. There's always disagreement with every decision that a decision maker makes in the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. There's someone that's going to be disagree with it. And so it's important that these decisions are supported by law, and so avoid some potential lawsuits and even slowing the process down more. These laws and policies are important. So why is there controversy? So let's look at the size of public lands in the U.S. Roughly 30% of the U.S. land is owned by the federal government or owned by the public and administered by the federal government. 48% of the 11 western states are administered by some federal agency. Alaska alone, 69% of Alaska is federally owned, and then 4% of the other states. I have a map here that shows the percentage of federal lands in each of the states. And if you notice, there is a heavy concentration of these public lands in the western United States. Nevada, if you notice, is 84.5% publicly owned. So So that's why it's important. You can see here the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. You can see the different jurisdictions of public lands on this map in the western United States, at least. Okay, so anyway, the Bureau of Land Management administers 248 million acres. The Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, administered 89 million. 80 million by the Park Service. That's in the department. All those are in the Department of Interior, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Park Service. In the Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service administers 193 million acres, and then 12 million by the Department of Defense. So that's a total of 622 million acres. So I guess that is the purpose of this, is to emphasize the importance of these laws and the importance of being consistent on public lands. So here's my timeline. I want to take you through the history of these different environmental eras. And so I want to talk about the frontier era. We'll start out, I basically said we'll start out with the 1600s. We'll actually start out with more of after the Revolutionary War and after the U.S. became a country independent of Great Britain. But anyway, we'll start out with that, moving west, the frontier era, the early conservation era, and then talk about the environmental era, and then we'll talk about some specifics of these laws. So the frontier era, the one thing I wanted to emphasize with the frontier era, is that there was a need, or there was a desire to move west. There's a desire to settle the land and to control the land. People's attitudes toward the land at that time was that there's this never-ending supply of natural resources. Very productive natural resources is what they had seen in when they first settled, and they believed that going west, as far as you could see, there would be this highly productive, never-ending supply of natural resources, and it was there for their taking, and it needed to be settled to control it, and so that was that's what the whole attitude and the movement was about. So if you see from this map, you see where the 13 colonies are, and then right next to it, the French had occupied a lot of that area that's immediately west, and then of course the Spanish, little Spain going up from Mexico, Texas, and New Mexico. So lots of things happened. You've probably read some history about this. Lots of things happened during that time in a squabble to get settlement and control of these western states in the United States. So I'm going to talk about laws that promoted the settlement of the West and actually encouraged the movement of people to go west and settle it for the U.S. And so, of course, most of this took place again after the Revolutionary War and independence. So here's just a few of those laws. One of them was the Preemption Act of 1841. So it gave 160 acres of non-mineral land, and that could be taken by a settler for $1.50 an acre. So it was a pretty good price back then. I'm not sure what their attitude was about $1.50 an acre. Might have been cost prohibitive in some cases. But then after that, the Homestead Act was passed in 1862. And so this, just living on the land for 5 years and claiming that homestead for a 5-year period, replaced the revenue. So there wasn't a need to pay for the land. It was just staking the land and verifying that stake and certifying that you lived there. And so there's several versions, or actually 3 versions of the Homestead Act. So the further that people started moving west, they realized that 160 acres really wasn't that big. So the idea was that they moved from this 160 acres, maybe or looking at 160 acres, a very more moist climate than when they started moving west. And as they moved west, they found that conditions were drier and 160 acres just wasn't big enough. So they passed another Homestead Act in 1909, and it allowed 320 acres, so a little larger area. In both of these, though, they were still expected to raise crops, plow the land, and that would be their livelihood. So anyway, there's problems with that too. And so as they got further west, and Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and some of those more arid areas, they just couldn't make it actually on 320 acres because a lot of them figured out that really what we want to do is raise cattle. We don't want to farm crops. We want to raise cattle, and 320 acres is not enough space for cattle, not enough forage for cattle. So they passed the Stock Raising Homestead Act, and it was 640 acres. So 640 acres here, of course, in Arizona, and even some of the short grass prairie in the plains is not enough land to raise 50 head of cattle. So here's just a formula. It's just really a rough estimate. But if you had no idea what your land would raise, you know that it's related to the amount of precip, which causes more forage production as precip increases. So here's just a general rule of thumb, and if you had 1 inch of precipitation per section, it takes 1 inch of precip per section per year to graze 1 cow. And so if you use that formula, one section is 640 acres. If you use that formula, then it takes, to raise 50 cattle, it takes 50 inches of precipitation. So there's not very many places in the arid Southwest that actually gets 50 inches of precipitation. So I'll talk about the Dust Bowl days later, but there was eventually some problems with that, overstocking and expecting that you could plow some of this arid land and not really being able to produce crops. And then in 1872 was the mining law. It preceded the 1866 Mineral Act, and it allowed a citizen to file a claim, and if validated, they could privatize the land. I'll talk more specifics about that in just a few minutes. And then the last thing in that era that I wanted to talk about was the Timber and Stone Act of 1878, and it gave 160 acres of non-mineral land, chiefly valuable for timber. And so the Timber Stone Act was an important act, especially for the Northwest, for timber production is so great. But anyway, one person could be sold that land for not less than $2.50 an acre. Okay, so there's also grants, the railroad grants, and then the education grants. And so you might be familiar with that. Railroad grants were specifically to get railroad companies to build railroads and to move west, and so there would be this highway basically for people to have access to west and to move west. The education grants you probably know about that, but it's a township is made up of 36 sections. A section is 1 mile by 1 mile, and so of those 36 sections, section 16 and section 32 were given for education. So for schools, also education, land grant, colleges, normal schools, school mines, those kinds of things. Those sections, that section 32 and section 16 were given for schools. Okay, so anyway, with all those incentives, the rush is on. And so back in the late 1800s especially, there was a mad rush for people that didn't have land to move west and to get land that they'd always dreamed about and to be able to produce their crop or raise their cattle. And so this caused some problems. I put in a picture of Oklahoma City in 1889, so that's kind of interesting. It was just a few buildings. I have a picture also of the land office and the line of people around the land office trying to get their certificates for their homesteads. And so basically this whole slide is to emphasize that once these incentives were known about, then people really started to move west and to try to get the land that they wanted and to claim it for their ownership. Okay, so anyway, when all this started taking place, eventually there's probably going to be some problems. So there's lots of reports at that time that say that there was a pretty destructive attitude, first of all, maybe the wrong attitude to begin with about these public lands, and basically that there was a never-ending supply of natural resources, and that it was there for them to take. And so forests were cleared, lots of forests, even some of the larger giant sequoia and coastal redwoods. A lot of those forests were cleared for cropland. And then not only did they clear these areas and try to control areas, a lot of it was that they believed that these were hostile lands in some cases. The Native Americans, indigenous people were there, and there was wild beasts. And I think about the buffalo especially. There was actually some bounties on buffalo to try to get them removed from the Great Plains so that cattle could use those forage resources. So there's a lot of movement and attitude toward controlling the land and not necessarily toward protecting the land for long-term production. So there's other things that went on. This is sort of interesting. You would expect this, I guess, but the stealing of public lands, there was cases where lumber companies would take these train loads of teachers or other people west so that they could claim their land under the Timberstone Act, and then they would sell it back to the timber companies. So a lot of that took place too. So lots of chaos that took place during that time. Okay, so anyway, there was lots of land that was transferred from public to private. And in 1850, the government owned about 80% of the land still. And so the Homestead Act of 1862, settlers, of course, were given their 160 acres, and then by 1900, more than half the country, the public land was given away, sold cheaply to the railroads, the timber mining companies, land developers, states, schools, universities. So land was going pretty fast, and by 1900, a lot of it was settled. So some of these settlements turned out really well for the homesteaders. Lots of them turned out pretty well. If you look at a forest map, for example, you might see a lot of private land along close to or adjacent to water sources or in canyon bottoms and those kind of things. And really some of the prime real estate, even within national forests in the West, are private land because of these homesteads. And looked for places that had water, that had forage and those kinds of things. So that explains some of that private land pattern. Okay, so basically the frontier environmental view prevailed until the government declared the frontier was closed in about 1890. So, okay, we're done as far as the movement west goes, and so they're basically talking about at that time the Homestead Act has served its purpose. It actually continued for a while, but basically they're saying the frontier was closed by 1890. So this map shows some of the routes of moving west. It shows the Oregon Trail. It shows the Santa Fe Trail, and a lot of that you see on this map. A lot of it is colored by showing the land that was actually settled. So the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, for example, is a big area that was settled going up through Colorado, and then most of the Great Plains showed that it had been settled, and then of course the West Coast, California, the gold rush and those kind of things caused settlements there. Okay, so I want to talk about what happened from there, the early conservation era. It's from 1832 to 1960. So it's during this time I mentioned the Dust Bowl days, and so there's some kind of environmental disasters plus some really great concern as far as how natural resources are used. So people were moving west and they were trying to make a living off the land. There wasn't any environmental rules as far as what size of tree can you cut and how much country can you actually plow, how close to the streams can you get, those kind of things. So there was basically no rules, and so the resource condition was starting to show that and show some real concerns. So a lot of this was brought about, or a lot of the attention was brought to the country by some of the early conservationists. Henry David Thoreau and then George Perkins Marsh were a couple that were important people at that time, is bringing this, the reality as far as our natural resources conditions to light. So Thoreau wrote a book, Life in the Woods. He built a cabin and stayed in the woods, and basically this book brought to light some of the environmental issues and concerns that he had. And then George Perkins Marsh was actually a legislator. He was a scientist and a member of Congress from Vermont. And he published Man and Nature, and he brought a lot of these concerns to light through his book and then through his position as a congressman. So with all these concerns, then people started looking at ways to start to control this land that was not settled yet, and how do we actually preserve that land and protect that land. So the Forest Preserve Act was passed in 1891, and it established the responsibility for the federal government for protecting public lands and protecting it from resource exploitation. So that was an important act right in the beginning, giving the government the authorization, the authority to actually start protecting. The Forest Service wasn't formed in this first act, but later on it was formed. So here's, following up on that, in 1892, John Muir came into the picture, and he founded the Sierra Club, and he started looking at some of the devastation, especially in higher elevation areas, and later on established the Park Service through his work. So Muir advocated the protection of these large areas of wilderness on public lands for to stop human exploitation of these lands and basically allow these lands to remain natural. And John Muir lobbied for a national park system, which later on in 1916 became part of the law, the establishment of the national parks. So these environmentalists, the early environmentalists, Teddy Roosevelt was in this picture too, so he was a president that was important in the protection of our natural resources. But anyway, these environmentalists were important as far as bringing the problems to light. So I want to go through just a couple of the Forest Service founding laws and what actually took place to try to get some organization going and managing these lands. So the Creative Act in 1891, also known as the Forest Reserve Act, so it represented an end to a period of exploitation and basically starting to control the amount of timber harvested, and it basically stopped. So it took these lands where they established national forests, it took those lands away from being homesteaded. They could no longer be homesteaded, and so it allowed the Forest Service later on to control the amount of timber that was removed from these areas. And then, of course, the Organic Act gave it called for the administration of these forests, and eventually the national forests were formed in 1905. The Organic Act is actually the founding act that allowed for the management of timber and for the management of range management and the other uses on national forests. The Weeks Law, if you noticed in the map that I showed you earlier, there wasn't very much land back east that was, or there wasn't very many states that had very much federal land. And so but there are forests back east now, and they weren't established through that original 1905 Forest Reserve Act or the Organic Act. They were actually established through the Weeks Law. So those lands were occupied at one time by private individuals or owned by private individuals. And the Weeks Law allowed the federal government to buy those lands and to, especially if they were adjacent to other public lands, and manage that with national forest lands. The Transfer Act was actually the 1905 act that established the Forest Service, and that's when Gifford Pinchot was involved, and he brought science to management of forested lands. I'll talk just a little bit more about Gifford Pinchot and his work in a minute. So the President Theodore Roosevelt was important as well as some of the others, but especially during his time as president, they called this the golden age of conservation. He had a particular interest in protecting our natural resources and the outdoors. So his major contributions were designating public lands as wildlife refuges. He established the first federal wildlife refuge on Pelican Island in Florida. He designated the Grand Canyon as one of the first national parks, and then basically tripled the size of national forest reserves. So even when with the Organic Act, it started small with a few forests at a time, a few areas that were designated for protection by the Forest Service. But by 1905, after the Transfer Act, many of these forests were set aside for protection and use for timber and for grazing and for recreation and other special uses. And mining, I'll talk about that a little bit different. It's managed a little bit differently. Okay, so anyway, Theodore Roosevelt spent a lot of time and a lot of his energy looking at natural resources and how do we manage those to our lands to protect these natural resources on public lands. So this is a picture of he and John Muir on the Yosemite National Park at Glacier Point. Some of you probably had your picture taken right there on that same rock. This was in 1903. So in the early 1900s, I already mentioned that Congress created the Forest Service Act with that Transfer Act. It was led by Gifford Pinchot. It was a forestry educated person that brought science to the management of forests and resources. Gifford Pinchot, there's really an interesting book if you have a chance to read it. It's Breaking New Ground, and he had written this book, and it really shows some of the challenges that he had in trying to get these laws established and to get forests set aside for management by the federal government. One of the things he did is a lot of the Western congressmen agreed that maybe more management is needed as far as the timber resource goes, but they didn't really think about the range management part of it, and didn't consider that establishing the national forest would also include that they would have to pay grazing fees for grazing cattle, and Gifford Pinchot actually put that in the writing when they actually established or transferred the forest from the Department of Interior to the Department of Agriculture. So then it was grazing fees that were charged. So he probably caught some flack because of that. Okay, so in the early 1900s, again, Congress also passed the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act is important because it protected some of these historical and scientific interests. So specifically, it protected cultural resource sites and architectural sites and those kind of things from destruction, as well as natural sites that were of value as far as scientific work goes. And then in 1916, the Congress passed the National Park Service Act. So then declared parks were to be maintained and then leave them actually unimpaired for future generations, so that timber harvest wasn't a general practice in national parks, nor is grazing on timber. Okay, so and then the Park Service was also established during that time. Well, of course, there were different viewpoints as far as the way public lands should be managed, even amongst John Muir and Roosevelt and Pinchot. Pinchot and Roosevelt were more of not necessarily completely protecting the lands, but using the lands, but making sure that that use was sustainable, and we'd have these uses for in perpetuity for future generations. John Muir was more about preservation. He wanted more wilderness areas that were not subject to any kind of roads or motorized equipment, mechanized equipment, and try to keep it as close as possible to the kind of pristine conditions. Okay, so I mentioned the Dust Bowl days a few minutes ago, kind of centered in the panhandle of Oklahoma, so southern, southwestern Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Kind of that was the major focus of the Dust Bowl days. These are areas that were there was kind of a perfect storm created. All the people were moving west. They were desperately trying to plow and make a living on their land. So during years when it was dry, their crops failed, and when their crops failed, there was no protection for the soil, and so a lot of this this area especially started to blow. If you've been in that area of the country, you know that during springtime especially can be pretty windy. And so once the wind started to blow and it started moving soil, it just kind of created this momentum, and we had this huge disaster, one of the largest environmental disasters in our history, the Dust Bowl days. So this was something that further caused concern and some changes. So some things later on, we get into the 1930s when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. They started establishing some new laws. The Civilian Conservation Corps, Tennessee Valley Authority, and the Soil Conservation Act of 1935. The Soil Conservation Act was a result of the Dust Bowl days, basically, and it was established to try to fix those erosion problems in the Great Plains. So that's the Natural Resource Conservation Service was established. Back then it was called the Soil Conservation Service, and now it's called the Natural Resource Conservation Service under the Department of Agriculture. So that was established. Things like the Farm Bill and those kinds of acts come from this whole law that established the NRCS. Okay, so then some more things. In 1934 to 1960, the Taylor Grazing Act was established. The Taylor Grazing Act basically took the remaining land that was not homesteaded. So at this point, most of the higher elevation land, the more productive land, the timbered land, was either settled and homesteaded, or it was part of the National Forest System, and so it was part of the National Forest. So that was taken out of the availability as far as homesteading prior to this 1934, so maybe around the early 1900s after the Transfer Act was passed. But there was still some of these poorer condition lands, maybe some of these rangelands and drier condition lands that were available for homesteading. And in 1934, a decision was made and the law passed, the Tailored Grazing Act passed, and it established the BLM, which manages these lands that were left. So the Smoky Bear Act was passed in 1952, and the Clean Air Act in 1959. And I think you see the value of the Clean Air Act. You think, well, Smoky Bear Act, why is that a problem, or is it good? And so there were some good and bad things about the Smoky Bear Act. In 1952, there was concern that, well, basically the Smoky Bear Act was just really to present this logo to convince people to manage and not to leave their campfires and to put out fires. But the attitude was that any fire is a bad fire on Forest Service lands. And the Smoky Bear Act was developed, so let's fight against forest fires. Only you can prevent forest fires. And the problem was is that the attitude changed so that there was an attitude of all fires are bad, and some of these ecosystems actually evolved with low intensity fires. Some of them evolved with high intensity fires. So fire was actually part of the development of these ecosystems, and now we realize that. And so in hindsight, we can look back and say we should have been allowed to burn some of these areas, or allow some of these natural fires to burn a little bit more. And then the Clean Air Act, the reason I brought that up, of course, is an important act countrywide as far as dealing with pollutants, and you probably talked a lot about that in your class. But this has an effect now on managing national forests also, mostly because of the Forest Service's prescribed burning policy. So it's not so easy to go back and burn some of these areas that should have burned naturally a long time ago. It's not as easy to do anymore because of the accumulation of smoke from other sources and the problems with smoke drifting down into cities and that kind of thing. So those acts are important. And then it just a lot of things developed. You probably know about and probably read Silent Spring. Rachel Carson's work was important as far as dealing with pollutants as well as pesticides and DDT especially. And so her book and her works brought that attention to citizens and helped to clean up streams, polluted streams, and stop some of the pollutants that were being introduced into streams, and stop the use of some of the dangerous chemicals. So now we'll get to the environmental era from 1960 to 2002, kind of that era. We look at a number of acts. The Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, the Wilderness Act of 1964, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and then the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. So all of those acts were established a little later, and the intent was to protect these areas, some of these areas that need protection a little bit more. The Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act, you think, well, if there's already an act that says that we will protect these lands, then why was another act needed? And the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act basically addressed that concern that some of these uses on national forests were overemphasized at the expense of some of the other uses. So range management in the Southwest was important, timber management in the Northwest, and then in some of the areas, mining was something that was more emphasized. And so the argument was that there should be room for also recreation, for wildlife, for protection of our watersheds. And so that's what the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act was about, was trying to balance all those uses and to recognize that there were more than those commodity type uses important too. then the Wilderness Act basically looked at some of those forested areas that basically weren't developed. They were roadless, or mostly roadless, and they had some criteria that was set up. Congress actually approved of the criteria that was used and determined whether or not a wilderness area was acceptable or could be acceptable to designate as wilderness. Okay, and then the National Historic Preservation Act, I talked about that a few minutes ago briefly, but basically these historical sites, a lot of that work was, a lot of the administration of that act is designated to the state, so there's a state historical preservationist, and so it's important to consult with them before doing any work in some of these historical sites. And Wild and Scenic River Act was similar to the Wilderness Act. They looked at some of these rivers that were not in wilderness areas, and the importance of trying to maintain those areas and preserve them as pristine type conditions, pristine areas. Okay, so I'll talk more specifically about these, and I actually have a slide for each of those, and I kind of went through it, jumped the gun and went through it, but I wanted to talk about multiple use and sustained yield. That's the act that I mostly dealt with when I was with the Forest Service, and so that was an act that you would bring up every time there was an argument about whether a recreationist has a right to fish in a pond or use the pond that's also being used for livestock, or even some of the areas adjacent to it. And when there was conflict, what act did you use? Could you use the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act, and that's what we mostly use. So sustained yield means that the achievement and maintenance, it means that there's achievement and maintenance in perpetuity of high level annual or regular periodic output. So these natural resources would be maintained forever, even though there's use. So use meant that they would be managed. Various of these natural resources would be managed, and there wouldn't be conflict with other natural resources. So multiple use and sustained yield. So be able to sustain the use forever. You're not using a resource, you're not managing it so that you're using it up, and there's also the other uses that would be recognized. And then the Wilderness Act I briefly talked about a few minutes ago in 1964, that's when Congress passed that act. So in 1970s, we're getting up to the 1970s, the first Earth Day took place in 1970. President Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, and I know you've talked about NEPA and probably the role that the Environmental Protection Agency has in NEPA. So that was passed in 1970, and then Nixon also supported passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. So the Endangered Species Act is something that we could talk about for quite a while, but the Endangered Species Act was passed to protect these species that were in peril, that were in danger of becoming extinct. And so it actually provided for a list of species that were endangered or species that were threatened. Threatened species were species that were in danger of becoming or close to becoming endangered. And so endangered species were species that were close to becoming extinct, and threatened species were close to becoming endangered. So it established that, recognizing the Fish and Wildlife Service would have lists of these species, and then agencies like the Forest Service would be required to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service if there is a chance that you would be conducting a project or activities or making a decision in an area that has these threatened or endangered species. So you'd consult with Fish and Wildlife Service and determine whether there is an effect on those species. There's other things. The Endangered Species Act also calls for the reintroduction or trying to conserve these endangered species, and sometimes the reintroduction of species into natural habitat. The idea would be basically to delist species that are on that threatened or endangered species list. Okay. The National Environmental Policy Act, you've probably spent quite a bit of time on, 1970, so I won't spend any more time on that. The Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act was passed in 1971, so it was basically those horses or burros that were unbranded and unclaimed. This act would protect those horses on public lands. That's basically what that's about. And there's a lot that's gone on as far as the Wild Horse and Burro Act, as far as that's concerned, and how do you, when the population grows beyond its environment or its capacity, then what do you do? And there's a lot of work that was done in adopting horses out and those kind of things, and there's lots of contention now as far as what do you do when they outgrow their habitat. Talked about the Endangered Species Act. The Freedom of Information Act is basically allowing people that were or it's requiring the federal agency to provide information to people who are interested in something that's going on in the federal government. And then the Federal Land Management Act was passed to require the Forest Service, the agencies, to go through a planning process and to disclose to the public the effects of management and the effects of plans on that national forest. The Rangeland Renewable Resources Act actually allows for, there's several things that happen there, and it actually ends up allowing for, after the collection of grazing fees, a percentage of that, those grazing fees, a fourth of that, those fees can go back to the ground for improvement of rangelands on the ground. So there's some, as far as the fees go, there's some routing of that type of money back to the ground where it didn't take place before. Okay, so I'm going to get to, I'm going to talk about some specific effects of these laws and how they're actually administered on the ground, and as far as permits go and uses of national forests. I'm going to take some of them one at a time, some of the uses one at a time. But first I wanted to say that it's a good place to pause.
Tommy and Carlos, do we have any online students with us? No. Anybody log in yet? No. Let's pause for a few minutes of discussion here. First of all, are there questions? Is this brought up any questions in your mind, what you just heard? Does it provide information you never heard before? Is it new information? How many of you got new information from this history lesson? Oh. Let's go ahead and turn these microphones on so we can pass them around. I do want everybody to say a few things about what they think is important about this history lesson.
Yeah, so I learned a lot about that the West did have a lot of public lands, and I heard of like Silent Spring, and he mentioned, I think, Pinchot and some other stuff, but yeah, this is more extensive history than I've heard in the past.
Aaron, any reactions on what you learned from this?
I guess one question that I could ask is, so is the Forest Service in charge of the burns that happen?
The question is about the prescribed burns.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Alford mentioned the nexus or the connection between the Clean Air Act and the National Forest Acts. There's several of them that he's mentioned here. I think it was I wrote down some notes. It was the Clean Air. Which one is closest to the Clean Air Act? The Smokey Bear Act and the Clean Air Act have a significant connection because there was this attitude in 1952 when the Smokey Bear Act was passed that every fire is a bad fire, and we've got to do everything we can to snuff them out. Even the lightning-caused natural fires, which are an important part of the way the ecosystems have evolved here in the West. He mentions that there are low-intensity fire ecosystems and high-intensity fire ecosystems. Some of these ecosystems actually depend on periodic fires to have the seed pods open up and the seeds become released, because in really pitch-rich trees like conifers and pines, the pine cones where the seeds are, they're really solidly welded together with this resin. And they need to have an occasional fire to melt that resin and release the seeds. Squirrels, of course, also will eat them and release the seeds, but the fires periodically are important for the health of the forest. And so that attitude was going on. And then we had the Clean Air Act where the cities were getting very polluted. Of course, there were several Clean Air Acts after 1959, but that was the first major one. And there was a recognition that the forest fires need to be recognized as an air pollutant. And if there is going to be a prescribed burn, especially around an area where there's what we call an urban land wildlife urban interface. Wildlife urban interface. This is where people have built houses in the forest, built cities in the forest, like Show Low and Payson and all those kinds of towns around here. But the forest is right next to them, and in order to keep those cities from burning to the ground in a forest fire, they started doing these prescribed burns. But the Clean Air Act recognized that the prescribed burns to thin the forest were also causing air pollution. So that's the nexus there. In Arizona, the prescribed burns are regulated by ADEQ because the Clean Air Act has been delegated by the EPA to ADEQ, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. And that may vary from one state to another. It really depends on whether EPA is delegating it. So go ahead. You had another.
Then they delegate that to Forest Service to do those burns, because they don't really control burns themselves.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, the Forest Service will propose to ADEQ that they want to do a prescribed burn. And it's usually at one of these wildland urban interface areas. And they have to go through a permitting process to document how they're going to control the fires. In other words, they have to limit the piles of trees that they cut down and not just make one huge mass burn. They're controlled burns. There only is enough fuel in each pile that they intentionally light on fire to burn for so many hours, maybe 8 hours. It has to be burned out within a certain number of hours. That's part of the prescription, And they also have this monitoring requirement. They can't just let it burn if the smoke gets into the city and causes the air monitoring station that they set up to show a violation of the NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standard, for PM10 or PM2.5. So they have to go in there and put the fire out. And they also cannot do, they cannot light one of these things up on a day when there's a high air pollution advisory. So those are the kind of things that are going to get written by DEQ into this permit before they can take a match to it and let it go up and smoke.
So Forest Service is in charge of it, but ADQ approves it.
Yeah, and ADEQ has the oversight. They actually have a portable air monitoring station. It's in like a van or something that they'll take around to the fringes of these prescribed burns, and you know they'll run the test. They have a permanent air monitoring station that is especially designed for the smoke from prescribed burns in Prescott. I think there might be one in Show Low too, but Prescott and Show Low get a lot of prescribed burns. Amanda?
Oh, I was just going to comment that's interesting because it's rare that a state agency kind of has precedence over a federal agency.
Now, Amanda's comment is about how did the state get control over another federal agency? Well, the way it works is through the authority of the Clean Air Act, which was designated by U.S. Congress to the EPA to administer. Okay, so EPA can choose whether or not to delegate to the states or to an air quality agency like the Maricopa County Air Quality Department or the Navajo Nation. They have their own air program, or the Gila River Department of Environmental Quality and the Gila River Indian Community. They received delegation from the EPA, and so along with that delegation comes this authority to turn thumbs down on a prescribed burn permit or let it go and say it's okay. And so they do have that kind of oversight authority. The Maricopa County Air Quality Department has an open burning permit process, and we have a lot of Bureau of Land Management and State Land Department lands where there are occasionally prescribed burns within Maricopa County. And so if they want to do something like that, they got to get the permit from the Maricopa County Air Quality Department. Other questions about the history lesson? I have a couple of things I wanted to point out to you that are important from that. There's this term in environmental law, or in any kind of law, it can even be tax law or food safety law or whatever, and it's called enabling legislation. Is anybody familiar with this term, enabling legislation? Amanda's shaking her head a little bit, maybe.
Because you mentioned like food safety. You mentioned food safety, and when I worked at in food manufacturing on the quality side, I had heard that term a couple times, but I don't know if it's real.
Okay, well, let me try to explain it a little bit. So, enabling legislation is a legal term that is used to describe where does a government agency get its authority from. And it kind of goes back to what you were just asking me about. How did a state agency get the ability to have any kind of authority over a federal agency? And it's the enabling legislation of the Clean Air Act, and as delegated by EPA to the state or to the county environmental department that has the delegation. So for the purpose of these forest land managers, BLM land managers, other public land managers, Dr. Alford gave us a rundown of several different pieces of enabling legislation that gave them the authority to have some control over mining, have some control over timber harvesting, have some control over how many cattle can be raised. I mean, you saw from back in the frontier days when they were mowing down the buffalo. so that cattle could graze. They drove the black-footed ferret practically to extinction because it was considered a hazard to cattle, digging burrows in the ground that the cattle would step in and then they'd break their legs. That kind of thing was going on, and so the ranchers hated it, and they just exterminated all these kinds of animals, prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, wolves, any kind of predator of the range cattle was just getting wiped out. There was no control. It was just wild, wild west, and the ecosystem was being terribly damaged. And so it wasn't until the 1890 something when this first enabling legislation first came along to give the federal government some authority to stop this ravaging of the ecosystems. I wrote it down here. It was the 1891 Forest Preserve Act. Was really important for giving the federal government authority, and then they established the National Forest in 1905 with the Transfer Act. So that it was enabling legislation to the National Forest to give them the authority to issue permits now and to rein in some of this negligent exploitation that was going on. Tired of holding this thing. Okay, so what are some other really important pieces of enabling legislation? There was the Taylor Grazing Act that established in 1934 the Bureau of Land Management. So now all these range cattle that the ranchers were putting out everywhere could also be controlled on BLM lands, in addition to the lands administered by the National Forest. So he explained it a little bit, but the National Forest is under the USDA. So USDA is like the parent government agency, and the National Forests are under that agency. But the Department of Interior is the BLM, Bureau of Land Management. You saw from one of his first slides that the National Forests and the BLM are the two largest land managers, land stewards for the entire United States. He gave acreage, I think it was 622 million acres, and about 90% of that is managed and run by and overseen by as land steward agencies by just these two. So those are the ones you're most likely to run into as an environmental manager during your careers when you have to go applying for permits and getting permissions and dealing with environmental impact statements and things like that. Let's see, what was the other one? The Multiple Use Act of 1960. That was really big because the mining companies, lumber companies, they were just clear cutting the forests and digging huge open pit mines. Coal mining was it's still going on, knocking off whole mountain tops, in the eastern United States. And so the recognition there with this Multiple Use Act was that these lands are not just there for the harvesting of natural resources. They also are there for the enjoyment of the public, so that people can go camping, fishing, hiking, hunting, whatever they want to do to recreate. And that wasn't when the Forest Service was first established. It was 1905, I think it was. They weren't that concerned about the recreational aspects of it. So it took this other act now to force the land managers like the BLM and the National Forest to consider these multiple uses. And then there was another one that was really important here that he mentioned about gave an order. This is like the congressional mandate ordering these land stewards of our country to write plans. so that we have good ecosystem management. And this is one of the things that Dr. Alford was very successful at in his career, is writing these ecosystem management plans for the national forests. And he wrote the policy for the entire United States. But it was the 1976 Federal Land Policy and Management Act that required the National Forest to actually write and publish forest plans. And I gave this as an assigned reading. I don't know if anybody has been reading my emails, but you will now find in the readings and assignments for this lecture the Tonto National Forest Plan. So that's what this Forest Management Act of 1976 requires the National Forest to do. They are now going through a big revision process. I think it was last revised back in the 90s or something, early 2000s maybe. And it's open for public comment. So you're able to read the latest draft forest plan for the Tonto National Forest. And if you read any of that, you'll find that it consists of a lot of ecological studies, biology studies, endangered species studies, watershed management studies, water quantity and flow type studies, hydrology. So there's multiple environmental professions that went into the writing of this forest management plan. And if you go to work for an environmental consulting company, your company might get retained to help a national forest write their forest plan. They need environmentally trained people to write these things. They're science-based plans. And based on the science, they say, okay, we can allow this many users per day to launch their boat at the Roosevelt Lake or the Canyon Lake. It's during the peak of the summer, I think it's Canyon Lake. They will actually cut off the number of boats that can be launched. And that's because it was written into the forest plan that there's going to be overuse of this lake if we, just let anybody come here on the weekend in the middle of the summer and launch a boat. They spew gasoline, they emit carbon monoxide. They're dangerous because people are running them left and right. A lot of times people are drinking and operating their boats. And there's deaths every year for people running into each other on our lakes. And so, it's an unhealthy, unsafe situation if they let too many out there. So that's just an example of the kind of stuff you'll read, in these forest plans. So this is really good stuff for environmental protection here from a natural resource point of view. One other thing before I restart the video, unless you want to take a break. You want to take a break before I restart the video? Yeah, okay. Let me just give you another one of my recollections or reflections on this history lesson. And that's mostly related to all these different acts and NEPA. NEPA was 1970. We've already been over NEPA, first day or two of the class. Spent a lot of time on National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. And you may recall from some of my slides that there's these long, long lists, hundreds of different laws that NEPA relates to. That if you're going to do a NEPA required environmental impact statement, EIS, because there's a finding that there is going to be a significant environmental impact from your proposed development of the land, then you have to write a full-blown environmental impact statement. And when you write a full environmental impact statement, you've got to consider all these laws that he just rattled off. And you'll see in the slides I have for the NEPA presentation, these are the same laws are mentioned. The Antiquities Act, the Historical Preservation Act, the Wilderness Act, the Endangered Species Act, on and on and on. And so it's really important to recognize that these things are all part of our overall environmental protection system here in the United States. And that's a take-home message I hope everybody gets from this class by the time you get
through with it at the end of the semester. It's not just one big important act like the Clean Air Act that drives the whole thing. They all work together. They all talk to each other. And NEPA is probably the one that brings it all together more than any other of those laws to make sure that there's this systematic approach to how we protect our environment. Does that make sense? Okay, I mean, we developed, I think, a very sophisticated and valuable system here in the United States that many other countries of the world have since adopted. There's other countries that are doing better than we are, especially when it comes to protecting their endangered species. We're a world leader when it comes to environmental protection because of this system of laws. Okay, well, how about online students? Anybody there for us to get questions from? No? All right. Going once, going twice. Michael, did you have a question? Nope. Break time. Again, and I probably will pause it one or two more times. So we ready to go? Turn off my microphone. Is it recording yet? Yes, it's recording. Here we go.
We know there's laws, and talked about several of those laws which are important and why they were, why those laws were written. So we have the laws, and so that is the big interpretation of what is the purpose of this. It tells you what the purpose of this law is. Right? It's protecting these natural resources on the ground. But each of the agencies also have these federal or these regulations. So the regulations, this code of federal regulations actually focuses that and interprets the laws, and it gives you more specifics about what that law is requiring and what you're required to do to comply with this law. CFRs, you've probably heard of, the codes of federal regulations. If you were to look for, there's different codes of federal regulations for different agencies and different uses. And you can find those on what you can just look up Code of Federal Regulations as far as that goes, and you'll find. Be sure you're at a government site, so you're not using a site that's not reputable. But you can go to the Forest Service, which is fs.fed.us. You can go to the BLM, it's blm.gov, or just go to the General Printing Office, GPO, and you can find the Code of Federal Regulations.
Okay. The reason I'm pausing it is because I always direct students to go to ECFR. And, he did not mention that in his recorded session, but it's ECFR. And if you just put that in the Google search thing and hit it, it'll pop up probably .gov. It's probably a www.ecfr.gov, but that's the place to find the CFRs for any of these, no matter whether it's a land management agency
They're
or
really
EPA.
set up back when I was with, early in the Forest Service. You had all these manuals, just, bookcases of manuals, and you'd have to look at maybe the law in one manual and the CFR in one manual and then policy and handbooks. And it'd take days thumbing through it. Now they're organized well enough that you can just click on them and you know the topic or the direction that you're going. You can click on it and it brings it up on your screen and you can find it really easily. Okay, so you have laws and you have regulations that interpret and get more specific about these laws, and then policy. So the federal agencies, the BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, also have their policies. So their policy is introduced in the form of manuals and handbooks. So these are very specific, and they're intended to be direction that would be given to the federal employee on how do you actually administer a range management program? How do you actually administer a permit? Those kind of things. So the manuals and handbooks, some agencies have them on their website also, and some you may have to go to the agency to get the manuals and handbooks. Sometimes they don't update them and keep them very current on their websites. Okay, so I want to go through some of these things and just talk about these laws and maybe how they're administered that allow the uses on public lands or federal lands. So I want to talk about specifically about grazing, about mining and drilling, collecting stone, those kinds of things, and then timber harvest. So those three areas are what I want to talk about. I want to emphasize again that it's complicated enough that there's very few people that are experts in all of these things. There's experts maybe in the grazing part, and experts in mining, and experts in timber harvest, but they're so detailed and so can be so complicated that you definitely have to look it up. You won't learn all you need to learn to administer grazing, mining, or timber harvest just by listening to my talk, for sure. Okay, so I want to just I'll talk about grazing, and I might ask Al if there's some questions when I get through this, but I want to just give some general, maybe some different general rules as far as how grazing is administered. And in the CFRs is called range management. I used the term grazing so that you would understand what I'm talking about. But it was first, grazing on public lands was first, in the Forest Service was first allowed by the Organic Act of 1892. So it allowed for the management of grazing on these federal lands. So all domestic livestock has to be permitted by the federal agency. So there has to be a permit. You can't just go and turn out your burros or goats or sheep or cattle. There has to be an established permit. So grazing is regulated by the 36 CFR 222. So if you look that up, that's the range management section, and it goes through the permitting of livestock, the management of rangelands, and everything that has to do with range, the type of compliance that's necessary to do with range. So I'll tell you a little bit about some requirements if you decided you wanted to get a grazing permit. So a question might be, I think I'd like to be a rancher and I'd like a grazing permit on national forest. How do I get one? So you can imagine that not just anyone can go up and say, oh, the permit's available, I'd like a permit, because there's only so much land. And you're right, it's all been taken, pretty much. The permits have pretty much been taken. So the way ranchers have jurisdiction or have grazing privileges, it's actually called a grazing privilege and not a contract, is by owning the base property that's surrounded by that national forest. So in other words, here's actually the way this was set up. Is when the Forest Service decided we're going to have grazing permits, we got to decide who gets a permit. Then there was this grazing board that was established, and local people that worked for the Forest Service made a determination about how many cattle could be grazed on this area and who should have a grazing permit. So it was basically, in the beginning, it was whoever was grazing it at the time, mostly. So someone might have a homestead and they've been grazing this land around it for a long period of time. They would probably be given the first priority as far as the permit goes. So say this was back in 1905, the grazing board would go out and they would recognize that this permittee, this rancher, had some private land and had been grazing this area. He ran 400 head of cattle, And the area seemed to support about 400 head of cattle, so they would designate that as a grazing allotment, and they would issue a permit. So the reason that's important is that's carried on through the years, and different forests have different requirements as far as size of that base property they must own. On the Tonto, it's around 10 acres, and some forests, they have to have enough private land so that it can compensate for a time that cattle have to come off the federal range. In other words, it would be large enough and support all the cattle that are on the permit if they needed to take them off the permit. That's not the case on Tonto. The Tonto has most of their grazing allotments are year-long, so they stay on the federal land year-long, and their private land is mostly used for corrals and shipping and those kinds of things. Okay, so anyway, the requirement is that they own the base property that's tied to that specific grazing allotment, and they own the permitted livestock. So a grazing permit will say that you're permitted to graze, let's say it's 400 head of cattle from January 1 through December 30th, and on this particular grazing allotment. So they have to own the cattle, they have to own the permit. So if you wanted to get a grazing permit, then you would either have to buy the permitted livestock and have the grazing permittee sell you the base property and waive, the existing permittee would have to waive those grazing privileges back to the government in favor of you as a permit, a prospective permittee. So there's a little more of a process there. You don't just go get a permit. And what usually happens is the grazing permittee would sell you that 10 acres of property, which by itself would be maybe worth $200 an acre. But with the permit tied to it, you'll probably sell it to you for more like $3,000 an acre or something like that. So there is a value to it. The Forest Service doesn't recognize the value to the permit itself. It's a grazing privilege. The Forest Service has to approve that issuing of the permit to you, and they don't recognize the value of the permit itself. But that doesn't mean that the existing landowner doesn't recognize the higher value of that land that you buy because it has a permit tied to it. Okay, so I want to ask Al quick, is there a question about that? Can you think of? And I'll repeat that.
My question was about the environmental requirements, for example, do they need to monitor stream deadening, riparian areas, or damaged soil erosion?
Okay. So that was an important question. Al's question was, does the grazing permittee have to analyze or evaluate or monitor environmental conditions so that they can show that they're not degrading stream conditions, watershed conditions, and those kinds of things. One thing that I forgot to say a while ago is this use on national forests, this grazing use, is subject to NEPA and all the environmental laws. So before a permit is issued, the Forest Service has to go through that NEPA process and evaluate environmental conditions. So, so part of that, would be that you would protect natural resources. So all of those issues that could be on issues or opportunities that could be on that grazing allotment, maybe there's an endangered species, maybe there's an important stream for endangered species. All those kinds of things have to be complied. You have to comply with the laws. You have to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And to do that, then there would be a need to continuously monitor to make sure that you're staying in compliance with those environmental laws. So that's important. They're still, even if they have a permit, they still have to comply with all the laws, or the permit can be taken away by the Forest Service.
Everybody get that? So it's not just a blank check that the National Forest or the BLM gives to the rancher. go do whatever they want, you know. As long as you don't go over 400 cattle, you can go do whatever you want. It's not like that, you know. The cattle are going to be defecating, and the feces and bacteria and all the manure, you know, that can get washed into the rivers, lakes, streams that are on that rangeland. And then they also can be stomping down the plants around, especially around these waterways, you know, riparian areas, and causing excess soil erosion. So the federal land manager, in this case it was the Forest Service that Dr. Elford ran, has the responsibility of, you know, looking into these things and making sure that the land is not being exploited to in a way that causes a violation of other environmental laws. And they could actually deny the permit or take the permit away. Amanda?
There was a case, and it was about a year or two ago, of it was BLM land, and it was some ranchers out in, I believe, Elko, Nevada, or somewhere around there. And I believe they weren't meeting the standards of the Forest Service and the BLM, and they had theirs revoked, and it was quite a legal battle.
Yeah, I remember that there was a grandstanding going on. This rancher got all of his buddies together and cowhands or whatever, and they had a standoff against the federal government, marshals or whoever they sent out there to evict them. Is that the same one you're thinking about? It was
I
a
think
big
so.
news story about how they called that the sagebrush rebellion type of attitude. One of our speakers mentioned that, the sagebrush rebellion. Who was that? Mitch Klein, I think, might have talked about that. But it's the whole idea of, you know, this frontier mentality that was rampant back before we had all these environmental requirements, that the West is here for our taking. It's ours to exploit. And it was that way of thinking is still going on, you know, in the minds of a lot of folks that have owned this property. It's been handed down from generation to generation, and especially in the ranching areas of the West, generation to generation. They get their great-great-grandfather, whoever, got it for free under the Homestead Act, just by coming out here in 1800 something and staking it out and living on it for 5 years. Never had to pay a nickel to the federal government. And that same 160 acres or 400 acres or however many acres they grabbed during the homestead land grab time has been passed down from generation to generation into that family, and they feel like they could do whatever they want to the land. And they're very upset now that the federal government's coming in and trying to prevent them from doing whatever they want. So that's the sagebrush rebellion type of mentality that we deal with here.
Yeah, so I think in that case, the federal government did kind of win the battle, and they eventually were told that the federal government does have the legal grounds, at least if I'm correct.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in most cases, it has to be really bad before these land management agencies actually do something about it. You know, maybe there's some conservationists that have gone hiking through the rangeland, and they were appalled by the damage that was being done. And so they complained to the land management agency, the National Forest in most cases, that you guys should go out there and look at the mess that these cattle have caused. And that has happened in several places. We have a couple of areas here. The San Pedro River is one, and the Hart Prairie area of Flagstaff, up north of Flagstaff by the highest peaks of the state. And those areas were getting seriously overused and damaged, and the conservationists were complaining, and finally the Nature Conservancy stepped in, and the Grand Canyon Trust as well. I think they took donation money from people, largely environmentally conscious people, and bought these grazing rights and bought these properties out from under the ranchers, so they couldn't keep on doing this anymore. You know, and now if you go hiking in Hart Prairie, it's one of the most beautiful places in the state to hike. But it wasn't that way before. It was just overrun with cattle once upon a time. Okay, enough. Let's turn the movie back on here. Any other questions before I turn the movie back on? Oh, yes, go ahead. We need to get the microphone going back there.
Do the agencies only care about the environmental impact on the land? Do they care about the grazing impact of air pollution or something about the air? Do the land agencies care about the air pollution of grazing?
Okay, so the question is about these federal land steward agencies like the National Forest. Do they care about air pollution getting on their land? Am I correct? Is that what your question is? Do they care? Can they do anything about it? Yes, to a limited degree. The Clean Air Act has two major provisions, and this might give some of you who are, the law test is already turned in, right? It's done, okay. Well, this is the answer to one of the questions on the law test. Clean Air Act has two major provisions that have this nexus with the National Forest land. And one is the regional haze rules, where the state has to write a plan that they submit to the EPA about how they're going to protect the visibility of the area that's covered by the regional haze rule. And much of that area is administered by the National Forest and BLM, as well as the Grand Canyon National Park. And so they have written into the SIP, we're going to limit the number of vehicles on roads. We're going to apply dust suppressants on dirt roads. We're going to have more controls over prescribed burns. We're going to maybe close down some forest roads and block them off and put barriers up so that there's fewer vehicles running around the land causing dust to be generated. And, so yes, they have to be a part of the Forest Service, and the BLM have to be a part of the writing of these plans, how they're going to contribute towards this goal of restoring visibility to frontier days. And then the other major provision is Title V of the Clean Air Act, where if a Title V major source facility of air pollution is going in anywhere within, I think it's 30 miles of the boundary of a wilderness area, or any kind of a Class 1 area, including a national park. Mostly it's national parks and wilderness areas. I think national monuments are also on the list. Then they have to do the permittee has to do an analysis of the impact of their pollution on that Class 1 area. And that's all written into this PSD, Prevention of Significant Deterioration, part of Title V, with the idea there that the facility, this new facility, can't ruin the recreational, especially the recreational enjoyment of that Class 1 area. The third way, I guess I should have mentioned this, there's actually three, now that I'm thinking about it, major connections, and that is the NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards themselves, for the criteria air pollutants, especially ozone, have what we call secondary standards. So there's a primary standard to protect human health, and there's a secondary standard to protect everything else, like bugs and bunnies and plants and agriculture and statues and the rubber on your tires. Those are what they call secondary standards. And so the EPA has to look at both primary and secondary impacts, and usually what drives the secondary impact standard setting is the nearest impacted sensitive species to the non-attainment area. And, you know, we've seen acid rain, for example, causing really bad deforestation and destruction of aquatic ecosystems. And so the setting of the NAAQS for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides was largely driven not only for human health purposes, but also to, you know, to conquer the problem of acid rain. You know, so that's those are 3 examples of how I can see that these land managers have to weigh in on the rulemaking process and be a part of the big picture.
So I have one more question.
I was thinking, the main ones there might be clean water in, if they're going to determine a clean bed, have to pour a sewer, they can still pour it in the air permit, would also have to be required, or would they, if you national pollutant discharge elimination system permit, to allow cattle to basically pollute the spring.
Okay, so specifically, Al was asking about water pollution, for example, and is there a need for a 404 permit and those kinds of permits where there is danger of polluting the water that would be used downstream for other uses and those kind of things. And usually with the grazing permits, it should be managed in a way that you're not causing pollution. If you're causing a lot more damage if you're causing water pollution. So usually the grazing permit doesn't require a 404 permit or specific permits. They do have, those kind of things do have to be addressed in NEPA as to whether they will cause an impact or not. And, you know, if there is, certainly if there's the possibility that it would cause this discharge of fecal material and manure into a local water municipality, then that would be dealt with. They probably wouldn't be allowed to graze in that sensitive of an area, but generally a 404 permit is not required. Anytime there's questions on something like that, then that would be brought up. You would bring that to the attention of the agency, Army Corps of Engineers. You bring it to the attention of those agencies, or Fish and Wildlife Service in case of endangered species, and then you would have to deal with that.
I know that there are lesser permits and general permits. So that if you ever run across a general permit, like something that is a petition of a grazing permit, that also has to comply with clean water and general permit.
Yeah, so Al's question was, do they have to comply with, sometimes if they're issued grazing permit, is there another permit that could be required, a conditional permit that they would have to comply with and called a general permit? And usually that's not the case. They would, usually all those kinds of things would be covered in the grazing permit. The kinds of protection or actions that they would need to take are part of the grazing permit itself. And that way there's terms and conditions in that grazing permit so that they would have strength to remove livestock if they aren't in compliance with those other laws. So they don't need to necessarily, usually don't need to necessarily call it another general permit, but it is part of the terms and conditions of their grazing permit.
I'm thinking that there must be some kind of exemption from 404 grazing permit that is written into this grazing and range management, probably the organic land. It might be somewhere in the Clean Water Act,
Yeah.
as long as you get a grazing permit from the federal land agency.
Right. Yeah, so Al's question is so is there, is there an exclusion, for example? So if you have this grazing permit with these terms and conditions, is there something that says then you don't have to have a special permit for 404 or those kinds of permits? And so that's an understanding. The general understanding is that there's terms and conditions of the permit that responsibilities for compliance of all these other laws. And so if, at any time, if they're not in compliance with those other laws, then they're not in compliance with the terms and conditions of the permit. So usually those agencies are okay with that kind of a, they don't need to have a separate document or a separate instrument to enforce the compliance with those terms and conditions. So I'm going to go on to, oh, the thing that I forgot to bring up is there is grazing fees with these grazing permits. And this year they're $1.69 an animal unit month. You probably consider that to be a pretty good deal. This is derived from a formula that's approved by Congress, and it has to do with basically the stock market, beef prices, cost of feed, those kinds of things. And I've never seen the fees go over $2. I don't remember it ever going over $2. It's usually around, a few years ago, it's $1.35. I can remember getting down as low as $1.25 an animal unit month. So an animal unit month is for one cow, could be a cow and a calf, a nursing calf for 1 month. So an animal unit is this one cow and calf for 1 month, $1.69. So that's paid on an annual basis. Okay, so I'm going to go on to timber, and timber can be, well, it's a little more complicated for me because that's an area that I didn't work in as much, and there's just so many different variables as far as timber sales go, and how those sales contractors are actually set up. But the Forest Service has the authority to manage timber under the Organic Act and under the Forest Reserve Act. It's regulated under 36 CFR 223, which is the sale of products. There's also other timber-related regulations under CFR 223 also, as far as how these how you manage for these different stands of timber, different types of timber, and how silviculture exams are done and those kinds of things. And then there's many handbooks. There's handbooks on how you do different types of silviculture exams, how you set up these timber cells. And so they're very specific and very detailed on how timber is managed. So timber also has to comply with NEPA and other environmental laws. If you wanted a timber cell, the Forest Service is in charge of setting up these timber cells, and so they would basically set up a cell and advertise it for bidding. So when they set up a cell, so a larger timber cell can take many years to actually develop. They would start, of course, with their silviculture exam and identify the different age classes of trees and all the different issues, deal with threatened and endangered species and all the issues that would be involved in that timber cell. Then they would propose that cell and take it through the NEPA process. Whether they do an environmental assessment or whether they do an environmental impact statement, it's something that's very time consuming. So it's not unusual to see a timber cell, once it's started, for it to take up to at least 5 years sometimes, up to 5 years, even more than 5 years sometimes, depending on the issues. So once the cell is set up, then they can, the Forest Service would advertise this. If you were interested in it, you'd have to show that you have a viable logging business, and you could bid on that cell. There's a minimal bid price that the Forest Service would not accept. If it went below a base bid price, then they wouldn't have to sell the cell. In timber, one of the concerns is that even with all the idea is that they would, at these base prices, that they would be able to cover the costs of the timber cell. And lately, they have not been able to cover the costs of the timber cells, and so that's an argument about whether the base prices are too low or what's going on. But basically, that timber sale, you know, in most cases would cover the whole costs of doing that operation. The bidding, all the operation is, except possibly NEPA and the Forest Service of work, that wouldn't have to, the sale wouldn't have to pay for that, but the logger would have to pay for the access, the construction of roads, the after the sale, the closure of these roads, and all the restoration type work that would need to be done afterwards. Plus, if there's other work that needs to be done, thinning or planting of trees and those kind of things, that would be covered somehow by this timber sale, either by the collection of a portion of that that bid, or paid by the work that's paid for by the work that the timber operator does. You have any questions about that, Al, about timber sales?
So there's a basic question about whether or not these logging companies end up having to get clean water act for the cycle. And if they even sell it for, if they're gonna build a road across a range and water, and you have to bring the clean water act, and they usually have to get a 404.
Right, yeah. So if they're, so the same type of question, and this one actually becomes a little bit more critical because there could be cases where they're crossing a stream or they're affecting a stream. Normally, when they go through the NEPA process, you would want to just keep them out of there. You would want to keep them out of the stream and avoid having to pollute a stream, and that kind of thing. So normally then that timber sale contract would deal with that. I mean, you can't pollute the stream, you can't drive, you can't cross it. I can see issues where maybe in the Northwest, at least, in areas that I'm not familiar with, where maybe there is an initial haul route that crosses the stream. There's just so much more water up there that you'd have to deal with those special permits somehow. And in that case, that probably would be outside of the timber sale contract. You would probably have a separate permit for 404 or whatever kind of permit that's needed.
I guess what you're saying, contract, timber deal might specify an area where the trucks have to go across and already existing bridge.
So,
Already been, they're the board of clean water act in past, or guys for the board permit that was filled a long time ago, and they can't make a new spot.
so specifically, Al's question was, could the timber sale contract specify the exact haul route and exactly how the logger would access the area? And that's true. The timber sale contract could have control over the route, even before they get to the timber sale, the route that they would take. And so, because that's one of the impacts of that timber sale, even outside of that. And so it would control the access. It would tell them which roads you cannot use, and they would have to comply with that. Okay, shall we go to a tougher one? Mining. Mining is really interesting. Mining, of course, was established back with the 1872 mining law, and it's interesting the way it's actually controlled. It's regulated by the Forest Service under CFR 228. But here's what's interesting about it is that mining claims are actually administered through the Bureau of Land Management. So the Bureau of Land Management, even for the Forest Service, the mining claims are managed by, or the claims are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So they have these plat maps that tells where, whether an area is open for mining claims. So that was, when you make the application, then you would go to the Bureau of Land Management, even if it's on the Forest Service land. So that doesn't mean any kind of exploration still, whether it's mining, whether it's collecting rock, drilling, natural gas, all those kinds of things. The claim is made through the Bureau of Land Management. You have to do, the miner would So any of those kinds of things, the assessment has to comply with NEPA also. And has to be permitted by the Forest, say if it's on Forest Service land, it has to be permitted by the Forest Service. So it's, you know, what the, I guess the policy says is that if there's no significant impact, then you don't even have to contact the Forest Service. But if you're driving into an area to assess a potential mine, you're gonna be, you know, there's gonna be some impact. Or there's gonna be a possibility of an impact. So if you're building a road especially, then there's gonna be an impact. If you're just driving across the surface, unroaded surface, there's gonna be an impact. So that, the idea of assessing this mining operation or assessing this area to collect rock or those kind of things has to go through the NEPA process and has to be approved by the Forest Service. But then there's such a big area as far as mining goes. There's lots of different conditions, whether you're talking about a huge Carlotta copper mine that's in the bottom of Pinto Creek, or you're talking about, you know, collecting some flagstone, you know, in an area that's been disturbed or something like that. It's just a huge area. And so there's lots of different exceptions. You have to ask questions about what's permitted and realize what could be required before you get into that kind of an operation. But say you're thinking you'll go big. Maybe you're a gold miner or something like that. Well, since I said gold mining, if you were just going out to an area that's already eroded and you're panning for gold, then that's something that probably you don't have to have a permit for. Now, if you find lots of gold and you decide you want to explore that area more, then you'd have to get with the Forest Service and decide whether the NEPA process needs to take place, and or depending on how much disturbance you're going to cause. So then maybe you are looking at more of a copper mine or something like that, and you have visions of this huge ore deposit, and it's on National Forest land. But if you have to go through the process to get to assess the area, and you have to go through the NEPA process. And if you do that and you are able to validate that you have a productive mining claim, then that land could be patented. So you could actually get patent that as your private land for this mining operation. In most cases, that's a huge expense. It's a bigger job than what it sounds like. You know, some of the people that have dreams of coming out west and owning some land by showing that they have a valid, you know, precious mineral claim, then it's a bigger job than what they realize once they get out. Just to get through the NEPA process, and then just to get through the process of validating that there is a significant amount of ore to show value to be able to cover the expenses. In this case, you know, in both grazing, there's grazing fees, and in with the timber, there's you know, the timber is paid for by bids. There's no royalties in mining, so none of the royalties go back to the federal government for the profits that they can make off of mines. See, there's something else I wanted to say about mining. Oops. So Al, do you have any questions so far about?
Well, I know Gerald Ruse is gonna be coming in to talk about the mining and environmental requirements, so I probably don't belabor that too, but I'm assuming it's gonna be the same general idea where the board permit, BLM permit, the patent, the mining permit, must have some kind of language that specifies they have to comply with all the environmental laws that are out there, like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act.
Yeah, so
They can't keep their claim unless they comply with environmental laws.
Right, so Al's question is that, you know, they still have to comply with these environmental laws, and so the way that's controlled is through, the best way that's controlled is through NEPA. So they'll have to show compliance with NEPA before the decision is made to allow that operation to take place. This is definitely an environmental impact statement, type, analysis, or depending on how, you know, what kind of claim it is actually. And so those requirements would all be covered, and then it would be specified in their plan of operations. So they have a plan of operations. NEPA would cover that plan of operations, and it would be specific about which laws, how they're covering each of those laws in protecting natural resources. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh, cool.
The other question I thought of as you were going along, Alfred, is about the oil and natural gas. It's somewhat similar to handling and mining claims for oil and drill for oil and natural gas.
Right. Right, yeah, so the question was, for oil and natural gas for exploration drilling and for actually drilling, is it the same kind of process that you have to go through? And the answer is yes. It would still have to comply with NEPA. It would still be the process of filing the claim with the Bureau of Land Management, and then presenting this plan of operations that have to go through NEPA. And so the Forest Service would have to agree to or authorize that particular plan of operations. And so it would have to be in compliance with all the laws, just like the regular mines, hard rock mines and those kind of things.
So for environmental impact statement, I know that, you know, it's assigned to the federal agency, you know, their responsibility, but yeah.
Right.
So for huge compromise, like Carlotta, would it be a joint authorship by the National Forest Service and the UN?
So this is a good question. The question is, what about these really huge projects where you have an environmental impact statement that has all kinds of complications, right? And does the Forest Service write that, or does the BLM write that? And so the responsibility would be with the agency where the responsibility as far as making sure it's done is with the agency whose land it's on. So on Forest Service lands. But usually, I mean, always for those big mines, is the mining company itself will pay for the process, the development of that environmental impact statement. So they'll hire consultants that will go through the process, the environmental impact statement process. Now, so that consultant will continually stay in touch with the Forest Service at each stage of NEPA, and make sure that they're on the right track and evaluating the right things and asking the right questions, coordinating with the correct agencies and that kind of thing. So that's a huge job. Costs millions of dollars sometimes for a mining company to do an environmental impact statement for one mine.
And also there's uranium, I would say especially here in Arizona, so is that usually a regulatory commission, BLM, who's got what's on that?
So the question was, is there a difference with uranium mines? Is there a difference as far as the lead agencies go? And I would assume that it goes through the same process, but there's got to be other, you know, nuclear. You've talked about agency, right? NRC would actually be responsible for in this process and how you deal with it properly. And I'm not familiar with that particularly, but I'm sure that that's something that has to be done when you get to that, addressing that issue, how you deal with these this radiation and those kinds of things.
But most of these kinds of mineral extraction, natural resource extraction, have permits and always a lead agency that does it, they coordinate.
So Al's question is, as far as, usually in these mineral, extraction type activities, there has to be a number of different agencies that are involved in this, and, is there a lead agency? And so the answer is yes, there's a lead agency, and, so they're, so if it's on National Forest lands where this is taking place, that Forest Service will be a lead agency. They may have, a contractor that's overseeing the specifics as far as the process of NEPA goes, and then other agencies, other regulatory agencies would be part of evaluating those impacts and giving input.
How about state? Make any general things about the requirements of state land?
So the question was about state land, and I really can't make much of a comment on how state lands do it. There's also some federal laws, of course, that they have to comply with, and so they go through a process to evaluate environmental conditions, but they usually don't go through the same environmental impact statement process that the Forest Service does or the Bureau of Land Management does. They may do a hazard analysis, they may call it something else, but there is a process that they go through. And then if it's a federal project, even if it's on state land, if it's funded by federal funds or something like that, then they do have to comply with NEPA.
I know, when I was an environmental director for the county, state land had a big problem with ATVs, and all the ranges, and stirring up the dust, and it really didn't contribute to our and problem, and the state land department had to crack down. We realized that they had a responsibility to prevent excess dust on their land. We also entered into contract with companies and they required a cleanup. Big one was Kelly Hansen, that was on state land, they're still paying for that. That could be over.
Right.
So the same thing would probably apply to federal land. If there was a contamination incident, permit would be held responsible.
Right, so Al's comment was that on state lands, there's actually a responsibility to comply with law, same thing as the Clean Air Act. And so there's a responsibility to deal with that. Also on federal lands, there's a responsibility and a commitment to deal with these different types of issues. If there's toxic waste or contamination or something like that, then they would need to work with the agency that's in charge of that particular issue, or even as far as that goes with the Endangered Species Act, Fish and Wildlife Service, they would deal with those agencies. So it's their responsibilities to make sure they're in compliance with both the federal and state laws.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
We're running out of time.
thank you.
That's this thing. I'm not sure how you get rid of this one. I'll probably about that. I think I got rid of it. All right, so we have a few minutes left.
Questions from the students? After hearing that second half? Which federal agency administers Endangered Species Act? This would be a good test question. Dr. Alford said it about 5 times, okay? Which federal agency administers Endangered Species Act? We know which federal agency administers the Clean Air Act, right? Somebody say it. The microphones. Which federal agency administers Clean Air Act? This is an easy one. EPA, which federal agency administers Endangered Species Act, ESA. Now going once, going twice. All right. I guess I should put that on the test, right? It's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay. So I think the overarching message here from this presentation from Dr. Alford is that there's lots and lots of government agencies involved, lots and lots of opportunities for environmental professionals to get involved, because you heard him say about these long processes that it takes to get something like a huge copper mine permitted, or even just a big timber sale. It could take 5 years for a timber sale to get permitted, because they have to do study after study for years, spending millions of dollars before they can actually, when I say they, the Federal Land Agency, can actually propose the timber sale or make a finding of no significant environmental impact, or make a finding of it's okay to build the copper mine. They call that the build or no build scenario in an environmental impact statement. And they have to, at the very end of this process of NEPA, prepare a ROD. Does everybody remember what a ROD is? Record of decision, which is the federal agency's decision on whether to allow this to happen or not. And that can take 5-10 years just to get to the point of a ROD for one of these huge, big projects, and millions of dollars of environmental consulting fees being paid to people like yourselves when you graduate here, going out and helping these agencies do the studies, or the proposers of the development do the studies, the oil companies, the natural gas companies, the coal companies, the lumber companies, the ranchers. I think the ranchers seem to somehow manage to weasel their way out of a lot of these things, what I can tell. But you know, certainly mining, and you're going to hear from Mr. Roos next week about the tremendous amount of environmental control over mines nowadays. Back in 1872, there was not much going on at all, and that's why they had to pass that law. It required some control over mines, because once again, the landscape was being dynamited without concern about plants, animals, and the ecosystem. So there's lots of opportunities for environmental professionals to work in this area of natural resource conservation through the process that's been set forth. What do you think happens after the ROD has been issued by one of these federal agencies for something like a copper mine? Is it over? Is the environmental permitting process over? Nope, I see a lot of head shaking no. What comes next? If you're a mining company, want to build the big new resolution copper mine over there by Superior, and it's going to be what, the size of the meteor crater. That's what John Godek told us in the environmental leadership class. Can you imagine the environmental impact of something like that? Oak Flat will be destroyed. There'll be a 80-foot mountain of tailings built over by Queen Valley. This is over a period of decades, before it's all built out. These are huge environmental impacts. So even if the National Forest, this is Tonto National Forest, that's the lead agency for the Resolution Copper Mine environmental impact statement process, if they finally get to a point 5-10 years from now of issuing a ROD saying it's okay to build this big, huge copper mine, it's far from over. Can some of you think of some environmental requirements that this mine would have to meet in order to ensure that they're adhering to the ROD finding that was required by NEPA? They're saying maintenance and monitoring, okay. To determine what? Maintenance and monitoring to determine what?
Clean Air Act requirements, could be Clean Water Act requirements, endangered species, they end up finding a species that they overlooked or something. Lots of different things that they're
Okay.
maintaining.
That's certainly a part of it. Amanda's got something to add?
I was gonna say dealing with the hazardous waste from the mine and any kind of compliance that has to deal with that, proper permitting, transport, any kind of potential remediation.
Okay, those are all important points. Other students have ideas of what might come next after the ROD? But you're going to hear a lot more from Gerald Roos next week, but the Clean Air Act permits are potential showstoppers for these huge mines. Even if they get a ROD that says it's okay to build the mine from the National Forest Service, they still have to get the air permit from the ADEQ in this case, because it's outside of the Maricopa County jurisdiction. So this is ADEQ that will have the yes or no decision on the air permit. And then what else does ADEQ administer that is based on the Clean Water Act and our own state act? You've heard this from other speakers already before in this class. That's right. Aaron says the Aquifer Protection Permit, APP, they have to get that also from ADEQ, which requires them to meet, what's the acronym? Starts with a B. Best?
Available control technology, was it?
Yeah, you're pretty close. You know, best available demonstrated control technology. They call it BADCAT in Arizona. But it's, you know, the standards that have been written into our version of the Clean Water Act here in the state of Arizona, which is more stringent than the federal Clean Water Act. So our APP supersedes the Clean Water Act in this case. And the EPA likes it. They've delegated NIPDES permitting to ADEQ. And in Arizona, it's called a ZIPDES permit, Arizona Discharge Elimination System permit. So they're going to have to go through all those permitting requirements. I guess they don't have any endangered species to worry about, but in the Ponderosa Forest of Arizona, there's an endangered species called the Mexican spotted owl. Has anybody heard of that? And it's put a big damper on timber harvesting in the state of Arizona. There's been a lot of mills and lumber companies that have gone out of business because the Endangered Species Act has been enforced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect the spotted owl. And the National Forest is not giving out timber sales opportunities for the logging companies in large stretches of the world's largest Ponderosa forest in our own state. So that's an example of how an environmental law can be a showstopper on the harvesting of natural resources. Do you think that's a good thing to protect an endangered species? Yeah? What if you were, your whole family was based on income from from the forest? Would you have the same feeling about it then? Yeah. So it's very controversial. Anybody online with us yet? No? I don't think so. I guess I could finish with a story about how I once tried to get a mining claim. This is not very instructional, but more of a interesting personal story. So a buddy of mine and I decided we wanted to have our own private campsite up in the woods. We'd been, going up to the Bradshaw Mountains just north of Phoenix. Here, it's between here and Prescott. Yeah, to an elevation of around 8,500 feet, really near the top. And we found a really beautiful spot with aspen trees, ponderosa trees, spruce fir trees. It was a really mixed forest with a lot of biodiversity, beautiful views, all kinds of cool air in the summertime. So we said, oh, we want to get our own campsite up here. So we went down to the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, to look to see if there was any unclaimed areas for a mining claim. Were there open areas that nobody had staked a claim on yet? This area used to be heavily mined for gold and silver, and it still is yielding some gold and silver even today. So we found one spot right close to where we wanted to have our own campsite that had not been staked out by the prospectors yet. So my buddy and I went up there with our compasses and our staking tools and everything. We're measuring the distances from the nearest benchmark, and we found somebody else's claim over there. They have to make it obvious that there's a mining claim there. They build a big rock pile and put a big white post in there, and then they put their map of their claim inside of like a tin can and seal it up. And if anybody wants to stake their own claim nearby, they open up that can and look at their map and compare, your measurements with the nearest benchmark. They call them benchmarks, the brass plates out in the woods there, and you proceed to stake out your claim that's not on their claim. So we did that. My buddy and I had our perimeter staked out, and we used the corner of this other guy's claim as one of our starting points for our claim. Just as we're about ready to finish and drive home, along comes this really loud pickup truck, stirring up all kinds of dust in the woods, and out jumps this grizzly old prospector with a shotgun. And he points it at us, and he says, I don't want no neighbors in here. You guys better get back to Phoenix right now. Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. My buddy and I, we don't carry guns or anything. We're peace-loving folks, That was the end of that mining claim and campsite staking process. But moral of the story is you could actually get your own little piece of land out there, and I think it's like $5 a year to have one of these mining claims. It's dirt cheap, and you have to stake it out and go down and patent it with a BLM, and then you have to show that you're doing some kind of mine-related activity like improving the land for potential mineral extraction. Let me tell you, there's a lot of loopholes to these things. And for a little individual, small prospector's mining claim, it's pretty much unregulated. But not for a big, huge copper mine, that's totally different story. So at any rate, I'm done for the evening. How about you guys? You ready to go home? No more questions?